Hello and welcome. This is the Welney Wash Road, a short section of road that makes up part of the 54-mile-long A1101. It's situated between Downham Market and Ely, and it might just be the most flooded road in England. It was very recently reopened following over 85 days of being submerged and impassable throughout winter, and it's still seeing closures during periods of heavy rainfall. It's a bit of an arse, really. When the road is closed, the diversion route takes you on a 22-mile-long, 35-minute detour, and for local residents and businesses, this is becoming quite an issue. But why does it flood so much in the first place? If you've ever looked at an aerial photo of Cambridgeshire, you may have noticed this strip of land that appears to be a bit out of place. It's known as the Ouse Washes, and it covers over 2,500 acres of land between St Ives and Downham Market, and to a certain extent it's a human-made structure. Back in the old days, like the 1500s, most of Cambridgeshire and the surrounding area was underwater. The area we know as the Fens was a tidal marshland that would regularly flood, but back then it was no bother because the main towns were built on islands or in elevated positions. However, in the mid-1600s, some genius realised that if one was to remove the water from the land, you'd be left with some of the most ideal soil for growing crops, and food was seen as a fairly important thing, so yeah, why not? A grand scheme was created by the 4th Earl of Bedford, who was basically a politician, and he proposed the construction of 2 rivers that would drain the water away to the sea. The first was built in the 1630s, and the second would follow a bit later in 1650. Known as the Old and New Bedford Rivers, they would run parallel to one another, creating a long stretch of land in between that we know as the Ouse Washes. The point of this land was to act as a water storage area during times of high tides or heavy rainfall, keeping it off the newly created farmland, but for the most part the rivers and drainage channels managed the job just fine. A little too just fine maybe, because with the land now drained it began to shrink. It consisted mostly of a marshy peat-like soil, and without the water it was used to, it dried out, and in doing so the land dropped below the river water level and, more importantly, below sea level, making it more prone to flooding. The result is that we've now got a 2,500 acre floodplain that, despite in places being 30 or so miles from the sea, is still affected by the tides. It's interesting because the Ouse Washes gives us an insight as to how the Fens might have looked before the area was mostly drained in the 1600s, but anyway, over the years we've learned to live with it, and of course with modern technology we've got a network of clever flood warning systems, sluice gates and all of that jazz, so when it does flood the impact is fairly minimal. Unless, that is, you build a village next to and an A-road across your 2,500 acre floodplain that has to close every time the floodplain floods. To be fair, it would seem that whilst locals expect the road to flood on occasion, it's only in more recent times that it's become an issue, with the road being closed for several days at a time, or in the case of the last winter, 85 days. That's possibly down to a change in weather patterns, but there's no getting away from the fact that we're dealing with land that, for the most part, is at or below sea level. When all the icebergs melt, this area is going to be the first to go. So what's the solution? Well, perhaps ironically, don't drain the land. That probably didn't help matters, but we're sort of stuck with that situation. There's not really a lot you can do. Actually, not quite. There's not really a lot you can do for a low price. With all the money in the world, you could bang in a lovely bridge like they did on the A412 at Meepal. This road also crosses the Ouse Washes and doesn't need to close when there's a high water level. The problem there is that the A1101 through Welney, despite its A number designation, just isn't an important enough route for anyone to care enough, so they're not about to spend millions on building a bridge. That's one of a few options being considered as part of several feasibility studies that are costing us hundreds of thousands of pounds. The recent studies revealed that the solution would indeed be expensive, costing anywhere from £4 million to £58 million. It's impossible to tell at this stage without further feasibility studies, for which £365,000 has been set aside. As it stands, the road will continue to suffer from regular closures until such a time that a solution is put in place. They're a bit busy with feasibility studies at the moment, so it's anyone's guess as to when that might be. I'd suggest never. Thanks for watching.